go ahead and open the stacks project that I created for you. And this picks up, where we left off last week with these different kinds of stacks. Now, obviously if you started the homework, you've kind of done more complicated things than this, but I want to show how state works. Just use a simple example, and hopefully this will also illuminate some of the more complicated state interactions that you're doing in the homework. So we have our different views, right? We have a V stack that lays these things. We have an H stack, right? So if we change this programmatically, right, it updates. What would be kind of nice is if the user could just change, right? When we run the application, if the user could just change these stacks on the fly. Because right now, once you run it, it's just fixed. So as soon as this compiles, you can see, okay, it's stacks, but these are the horizontal stacks because that's what it was when we clicked the build button. But it would be nice if this were somehow interactive. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is to remember that UI, user interface, in SwiftUI simply reflects state. It reflects data. And so we need some kind of data, sometimes it's called a model, for the UI to reflect. Essentially the model, the data, is the state, right? Whether it's showing the H stack or the V stack or the Z stack, and that's in the model, and then the UI needs to reflect that. So a very simple way, a very simple model to do this is to create an enum. Because we have three different things that we want to do, an enum is a great choice. You can have three distinct cases. A Boolean, right, would not work because it can only be true or false, which maybe you say, true V stack, false H stack, but how do you get the Z stack? So we will use an enum. And we're going to call this enum stack type. Now you notice I'm actually creating this enum inside of the struct, and that's perfectly fine. You can do that. You can declare or define an enum inside struct. It could also be defined outside, but we're going to do it inside because we're only using it inside of our stacks struct. And this enum is going to conform to a number of protocols, actually. The first one is string. And what that lets us do is it will actually have what's called a raw value of string. And you'll see how this is useful soon enough. We also will use a protocol or conform to a protocol called case iterable. What this lets us do is iterate through the enum, almost like an array where you have different cases, different states the enum can be. Well, now that it's case iterable, we can iterate through it. And the last one is identifiable. Oh, which it would help if I spelled that correctly. So identifiable gives a specific ID, which is a unique thing this enum object will have, which certain SwiftUI collection views will need, in particularly something called for each. So we're going to look at that in a sec. All right, so for now, just know that we have an enum. It conforms to string, case iterable, and identifiable. So let's give it some cases. Every enum needs that. That's why it's throwing a warning. We haven't set any cases yet. So the first one is vertical. Then we'll have horizontal. And finally, we'll call it depth for the Z stack. The other thing we need, just to set to make the identifiable work, we need to create a variable that is ID. And this ID will very simply return itself. So the type is itself, and you'll notice this is a compiled variable, like what we've been using in SwiftUI, where it instead of an equal sign, right? We don't have an equal sign. Instead, we have open and close parentheses, and we're simply going to return self. So its ID becomes itself, and the return is not actually needed. And because this is kind of so simple, I mean, normally you have the open close brackets, but when it's something like this, what you might do, is just write it all on one line like this. Okay, so this is our very simple model, but this reflects the different states that we want our app to handle, whether we want to show the vertical, horizontal, or depth stacks. So now we need a way for SwiftUI to interact with this thing. And so we need both a user interface element for the user to pick what they want to do, and we need a variable to sort of track the current state, which stack is being used. So in order to do that, we create a special variable. We'll say var, we'll say selected stack. And this will be of the stack type, which is the enum that we just created. And we'll also give it a default value. So when the app runs, right, we'll just have it start with vertical because that's our first one. The problem is this alone isn't quite sufficient because structs, as you remember from our previous lecture, don't change, right? They are value types. And you can't, even if you have a variable in a struct, but you want to change this variable, there's no way to get the whole UI to change. So we need something to make this work. But you may be noticing, well, there's no error yet. I mean, what's the problem? So why don't we keep going with it as it is, and then you'll see what I mean. So in our view, we don't want to show the learning stack, but instead, we want to show the stack dependent upon which selected stack we have. So depending which selected stack it is, then we want to show a certain view. So for example, if the selected stack is equals to vertical, then we want the view that it returns to be the vertical stack. If it is horizontal, we want it to be the learning H stack. And if it is depth, we want it to be the Z stack. So now our body will return something that behaves like a view depending on what this selected stack is. So depending on that, it will return one of these things. Now as it is, this works, and the default value vertical, it would always be vertical. And we could change this to horizontal and so on and so forth. However, you'll notice we have not made any progress. This is still something we have to change programmatically, right? The app itself has no interaction. It may be simpler this way, but it's still not interactive like how we want. So in order to do that, we need something that the user can pick and choose which stack they want to show. So it so happens there is something called a picker in SwiftUI. And we can go ahead and actually click the first auto-completed one. It sort of has a couple of options. So the first thing is a title, which is simply just a string. And we'll say that's stack type. The selection, though, you notice what the heck is binding and then weird bracket hashable. Well, so that means it has to be a binding to something that is hashable. And we don't know what either of those things are because we haven't talked about them yet. So what the heck is this? Well, that's what we're going to find out. It's something to do with this, But selected stack as it is not either of those things. All this is a stack type. So if we try to say selected stack, it will not like that. Now, we do also have this content, and you'll notice this open, close, return. This is exactly what I was talking about the other time. This is a function that returns a view, right? That's all this is. But there's some special syntax for it. So right now, you can see this is just a parameter that we pass into the constructor of the picker struct. But when I have this blue and I press enter, it changes. And this is the shorthand that we've been looking at. And this shorthand, right, is the same as these other things. Or sorry, well, that's a switch. It's the same as like the VStack shorthand. And so this inside the picker is where we would give the options. However, before we do that, as I stated earlier, this selected stack is not a binding hashable, and it is getting very upset at us about that. It's saying cannot convert value of type stacks to expected argument type binding selection value. So the issue is structs, right, when SwiftUI uses this struct, this stacks, well, where does it use it? It uses it, if we go up a level, use it inside the content view. And it uses it here. But if you remember, this is actually shorthand. What's actually happening is let my stacks equal stacks. And so this is a let constant. This is not a variable. And that's very intentional. You can't have variables in SwiftUI. The whole point is to limit state change to only specific things. This prevents certain kinds of bugs. So because this is a let, that means inside of stacks, even though we have a variable, this can't change. The variable can't change, and it can't affect these things. So we need a way around this, because sometimes you want just a little bit of state to change. So how do we do this? Well, Swift in version 5.1, they introduced a thing called property wrappers. Property wrappers have the @ symbol put in front of them, and then there are a couple of different things. You can have lazy, you can have, binding is one. So you notice that binding that we were talking about. And there's something called state. And so state is indeed what we want here. And so what state does, this property wrapper, it is connected to this variable, and it affects different things, the variable. I won't get into all the details, but essentially what it does is it creates this little pocket of state that's managed by this view, this struct, but it's outside of that struct. And what that allows to do is it allows this variable to change. So this variable now, because it's a state variable, can change. It can do things, even though this struct cannot. And what happens when this changes is the struct is watching the change, and the whole view updates. And so that's why when we switch on this, this will work. But there's still a problem. It's still throwing us an error. And that is because of the syntax. So when you use a state variable, and you have it like this, to use the state variable, not the type itself, to get that binding hashable type that this thing is looking for, you need a prefix. The prefix is the $sign. So if you add the $sign inside, it knows that this is a binding to the state, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then this will work. Now, some of the errors went away, you notice, but there's still some remaining, and that's because it's empty. This little code thing, there's still nothing here. There's no view. They're saying picker needs to return a view, and there's no view that it returns. So now that we have our state and all this stuff, we can create the view. One small note before I create the view, though, is typically when you use these state variables, they're only to be used within the struct itself. They're not designed to be accessed outside of it. So this is not required, but convention says that you will mark this as private. And in the Swift book, if you read, they recommend this. They say that state variables should always be private because they're only used inside your struct to give state just for that one struct, that one view. Okay, so it's private. So now we need to add a view here. So the picker, you can add views a couple of different ways. You can just add text, something like this, and give it a name, and you say my picker, and that will at least give like a label for your picker. But it's still not really complete, and it's not how pickers are designed to be made, because pickers, they want a selection, right, that's based off this, but you want to know what all the options are, right? The selected stack is just the current one selected, which happens to be vertical. But a picker is like a thing that you would choose, you know, one of 5 options or 3 options or whatnot. In our case, it's a stack type, and we have 3 cases. So we have 3 options. So our picker has one of 3 options that it can pick from, and we need to tell it about those 3 options. We've already told it, right, the selected one, but we need to say, well, what are the options to begin with? And the easiest way to do this is to use something called for each. For each is a special structure made by SwiftUI. So it is a structure, and it allows you to do kind of like for loop things. So it's sort of like a for loop, but in a SwiftUI context. And the main thing is that it, as you can see, it says it computes views on demand from an underlying collection of identified data. So you notice it says identified data. It's a good thing our stack type is identifiable. But yes, for each, it essentially loops through, like a for loop, through a collection of things and returns SwiftUI compatible views. So you can't use a regular for loop in SwiftUI. You have to use this for each thing. You can use for loop, you know, in other parts of Swift, but in SwiftUI, right, this is a UI thing, you need to use for each. So what we want to do in the for each is there's some parameters that it will pass through, and it's also going to have a closure. And I'm just writing the shorthand syntax already. So inside the closure, though, we do want to pass something into it. We want to pass a collection. It needs to loop through the collection. So our stack type, which is just an enum, but because we made it case iterable, that means we can iterate through the stack type. That means it behaves like a collection. Since it's also identifiable, it will work for each collection. So this is quite nice. So you say stack type and then dot. You say all cases. And this now returns a collection for our for each. And we can even option click. Oh, well, okay, let me fix the error. And then you can see that. So we have our collection that we can loop through. And now we need to show we still need a view. We still need to return a view, right? And so if you remember, we had that text. So we do indeed want to return a text, which is our label for our picker. And we could say, you know, select a thing or something like that, but that's not what we want, right? Because we already have a general label up here. The picker has a title, which is stack type. And this is our general label for the whole picker. So what is this label for? This label is for each of the individual of the stack type cases. So what this text, what we want it to be is for each one, we want it to be the name of the thing. We want vertical to be vertical, horizontal, etc. So in order to do that, we need to pass in, when we loop through all cases, we want to pass in one type at a time. It so happens that there's a shorthand to do this, and you give the thing you want to pass in from your collection a name, we'll call it type, and you say in. Now type could be whatever we want. We could call it stack type or whatever type works. And what that does is for each of these stack type, for each case, we pass in one at a time. And so as it loops through, we take each one of these things and we want to do something with it. And indeed, we want this type, which is a string with these names converted to strings, we want to use that string as the label for our text label for our each section of the picker. So what that looks like is type.rawValue. So the raw value is a thing that's attached with enums. Enums, when you give enum a value like ours is string, then it has raw value. And you can see it's telling us raw value is string. And that's great. Now, if this raw value were int or something like that, then this would not work, because then type.rawValue, once it figures itself out, it would be an int and it will throw all kinds of problems. There. So you could see it doesn't like it. But we don't want it to be an int, we want it to be a string. And so now, because that is a string, we get the raw value, which is, so it's this type name explicitly written out as a string, right? You know, you could say equals vertical, but we don't need to do that. We just use the default name. And in fact, but you'll notice these are lowercase, and maybe we want them capitalized or something like that. So we could say capitalized, and this will modify our string with the right. And even better, localized capitalized, which will work in different locations. So now we have a picker with a label for the whole picker. It is connected through this binding to our state object of the current selected stack. And for each of the options that we have, for each one, then we'll create a label to show that label. So our previous pause, because I've made lots of changes, so let's resume that and see what we have. Okay, so we do indeed have a picker, and let's zoom out so you can see the whole thing. Stack type, vertical, but we seem to have lost our other views. So why is that? Well, the reason is we have a picker here, and then we have a switch to maybe show, but these things, they're not in a container themselves. So the picker is being rendered, but this is being lost. And in fact, it's because it's adding something to prevent it from crashing. But we want to explicitly say, hey, this is all inside a VStack, because we want the picker at top and whatever view we're going to load below that. So we want to put this whole thing in a VStack. And I believe, yeah. So let's go ahead and add a VStack for our stacks. And well, we can, there's a couple ways you can do it. So like if we delete this and this, then we need to add another parentheses here, and it did the indentation for us. So now we have a VStack with a picker on top, and below that we have a switch. So below that it's going to show one of these three. It's not showing all three at once, right? It depends which is the selected stack, and then it shows which one. And our preview has updated. It's looking pretty good. It says stack type, vertical, which is our first option. The vertical is capitalized as well. And we can see the stacks below it that are the vertical stacks. So let's go ahead and run to make sure it's working as we expect. So here's our application. We can resize the windows. All right, at the top, it's vertical. Look, we have this drop down. It's vertical, horizontal, and depth. How is it getting this? Those three options is this for each loop, and each type is being put in there. So if we change to horizontal, it changes. And this is because the picker connects to that binding of that state, and then what that happens, the whole view gets thrown out, recreated, which sounds like a waste, but it's actually not. It's very like performant and efficient. When it gets recreated, it goes to this switch statement again, and this time it finds the horizontal. And so we can go depth, and we can see that, etc. So this is great. So now our app is interactive. And this is a good little learning tutorial that someone could learn about stacks. Hopefully this has made sense and is helpful as you think about the homework, right? This is a much simpler example, but I'm going much further in depth, so then you can do kind of the more fun or more complicated examples that you see in SwiftUI homework that Apple provides, but now you understand why and how these things work. One last little thing, just for fun, these pickers has a drop-down menu, but they do have different styles. So if you want something other than a drop-down, you can type dot picker style. So you see, right, there's modifiers. Sometimes there's common modifiers like border or color, but then there's unique modifiers that are special just for that struct, just for that thing. So this picker has a picker style. Inside the style, it has its own enum, right? Just like we use an enum, they have an enum, and they have a couple different options. We can see these here, and we'll go ahead and use segmented. And we can see what that looks like. We'll refresh our preview. And you can see it's changed. So instead of a drop-down list, we can actually see all of our options with this sort of slider thing. So to see how that looks, I can run up here, but I can also, this is our preview, but we can make our preview a live preview by clicking this little button here that says live. Now, if it's iOS, it would run just there in the simulator, but because it's macOS, it behaves a little funny, and it's basically the same as running on Mac. So you have to click bring forward, and then that will create this window. I've noticed a bug. Sometimes it creates two windows. I think that's a macOS thing, but needless to say, they both work, and this is the same as running it. And so now we have a live preview, just like we built it. So you can see the segmented control. This is how it works, right? As I click, instead of a drop-down, I kind of get this, horizontal tab thing. Apple calls it a segmented control. So you can use this in different apps, and has a nice interface. So we'll go ahead and return to the normal preview. And that is that. So that is sort of the basics of state. So I want to say one last thing. State is when we define it. You can, and then when we use it, right, this $sign is prefixed for the binding. You can also mention a binding. You could say private var some binding, this would be for something else. We'll also make it a stack type. And the difference with bindings are not set inside of this struct. They get their state from outside. They don't manage it. So for example, this binding, I give it a type, but I don't give it an equals value. I don't say dot whatever. In fact, it throws an error if I try to do that. It says, hey, what are you doing? You're trying to add this binding and give it a default value. That's not what binding is for. State, that's what state is for. So we get rid of this. And to see how this works, we have to go to the parent. We have to go back to our content view, and we have to look at stacks. And in fact, it's now throwing an error. It's saying, hey, you can't do stacks like this because it's missing an argument for parameter some binding in call. We go ahead and click the fix. So what you see is stacks, you have to pass in a binding inside of it. So here, for example, maybe if we go here, this state selected stack, we would remove that and place that here. And now we would pass, again, using the $ selected stack, we would pass it in. So this is how you share state with multiple views. So what you do is you add the binding, and we've now called it selected stack, right? But it has to get its value from somewhere outside. And that outside is this content view, where then we pass in selected stack, and we again use a $sign to say it's a binding, but this is the source, right? So this state is the source of truth. And so the state, now selected stack is outside. So what this means, for example, if I had multiple views, I can now share that state across multiple views. So this is where and why you move like the state upwards or outside of your view when you want it to share across. And we'll talk about more complicated ways to do that in the future. But this is sort of the basic idea. So you have state as the source of truth, and binding connects to that. So binding allows for two-way connections. So last thing, what you notice, this $sign, this binding, that's because the picker, it can change it, right? It's two ways. But if you notice, the switch statement, it doesn't have the $sign. It's not a binding. It's just the regular variable. And that's because, right, these views, they just respond. They update depending if this changes, sure, but they don't actually change this value itself, right? There's nothing in this code that changes the value of selected stack itself. As with a picker, when I pick different things, I'm actually changing this variable. So it's two ways, and that's what this binding means, is a two-way connection back to the source, the parent state. So that's what that is. But when you just have the variable responding to a view, it's only one way. And the homework will discuss this as well. And should be good. Let's see, there's some kind of error, so let's see what's happening here. So the reason why it's failing is because our previews, right? We updated content view to pass in something, but we didn't update our previews. So this is kind of annoying because now our, the project works, but our preview doesn't work. So it would be nice to fix this, but what do we put here? Like, do we have a whole another state? Do we have an entirely new state to pass in? But do we need that? It would be nice if we could just have one specific thing. And it turns out you can say constant. If you say constant, now we can just pick a value. And so we would say, right, we know it's of stack type, and then we'd say dot vertical. So now for our preview, it is just a constant that's fixed to always show the vertical stack. So now when we preview, the default is going to be the vertical. You could still change it, right, but it gives us this constant vertical. But when our actual app runs, we don't have a force constant. We have this state that can change and be modified and all of that. So that's sort of a handy thing. So our app is dynamic, but our preview is just sort of set. And what this means is you could have multiple previews, right? We could sort of change this to horizontal. We could, to change our preview. And you notice in the preview, the picker also changes along with the view. And that's all happens automatically, which is quite nice. All right, so that's it. And hope this is helpful and the homework is going well.